Right. Perfect. All right. So good morning, everyone. This is Tim Maher-Macias with OHCS. Thank you for coming to today's Ag Worker Housing Facilitation meeting. As I sent out the agenda, today we're going to be talking about some ALH. Well, first I'm going to be welcoming you. Then I'm going to be talking about some Ag Labor Housing Task Force updates and next steps. Then we're going to talk about the OHCS funding recommendations. This is going to be, I think, the bulk of the discussion, and we're soliciting feedback on that. And then figuring out the next steps for that recommendation. And then we're going to end. So to start off, I know we've had some kind of discussion back and forth about the governor's task force. Does it make sense to continue? Does it, should it be its own entity? Should it be rolled into this facilitation team? And so I don't think a decisive, no decision has been made as of yet, but kind of in discussions, it sounds like we will probably continue this facilitation team and try and roll in some of the participants of the governor's task force. So kind of give this team, this little engine that could, kind of a big boost as far as participation and who's showing up from kind of the relevant state agencies. So it's not much of an update. We've got, I think, 1 or 2 ALH meetings left. So probably for the next meeting next month, I'll be able to tell you formally kind of what that looks like. But that is kind of a discussion that's been happening back and forth between me and the facilitator. So the next big thing, and the reason for all us probably being here right now, is the OHCS funding recommendations. So what does that look like? What does it entail? I sent it out earlier or last night. It's not a huge document, so you didn't need to spend a ton of time looking at it. It is also, as you might see, not super in depth. And the reason for that is I didn't want to, or we as an agency, I think wanted to make sure we had enough space to continue to engage with people around those recommendations. We're going to make, basically what happens is we're soliciting feedback from the other state agencies around our recommendations, and then we're going to solicit some feedback from you all right now. Then we're going to kind of go back, do our kind of internal magic, and then present stuff again at the next ALH meeting. From there, the hope is to create or achieve a consensus recommendation from the task force. I asked Lou if it's just something I can say it's the recommendation and he has to go with it, and he said no. So that's unfortunate. They don't like power hungry Tim. But yeah, so we'll basically take this. There'll be this kind of last opportunity for engagement, and then those recommendations are going to go out and get made. So without further ado, I'll bring up. Do you want me to put this on the screen, Martin, and then you walk through it, or do you want to screen share and walk through it?
If you already have it up, go ahead and screen share it yourself, because I would have to go and pull it up. Okay, that would take precious time.
Okay. All right. Can you see this? Wait, that's not what I'm looking for. Okay. Can everyone see this? Can you see my screen, Martin?
Yep.
Okay. Perfect. So do you want to just launch into it then?
Oh, of course. Go ahead and
real quick, could you zoom in on your screen? It's very small. There we go. Thank you.
So this is merely this is the overview, basically just an introductory paragraph where we are we are essentially laying out our thought process behind our proposal, talking mostly about the diverging purposes of on-farm versus community-based housing, and the need for investments in both, but investments that make more sense for on-farm moving forward. Whereas community-based developers have the necessary connections and the necessary size of the project and agri-housing tax credit award to properly monetize it. On-farm entities do not generally have it, and it generally gets taken up by larger farm entities that actually can afford the upfront costs. But it completely fails smaller operators, and it leaves out a lot of farm operations that we would like to bring into the fold to make sure that we have adequate housing for on-farm workers, especially in labor camps. With that in mind, it says in there that traditionally there's been an 85%, 15% split, basically meaning community-based projects get 85% of the credits and 15% go to on-farm. This is essentially because even though we put aside 20% in the set-aside for on-farm projects, that amount does not always get fully utilized, and frequently the remainder gets pushed back into the community pool. This has happened this time in 2022 as well, with the increased amount of tax credits overall. It also increased the on-farm set-aside, and we are going to be returning $830,000 from the on-farm set-aside back to the community-based pot that will be released in 2023 through the Small Projects NOFA. So essentially what we'd like to do is, yeah, definitely go down to the investment framework. Thank you. So what we would like to do is we would like to retain the AWHTC and dedicate it exclusively to community-based projects. And we'd also like to launch a new dedicated on-farm investment. This will essentially create 3 buckets: funding to get to current or new housing up to Oregon OSHA standards, funding for improving select aspects of on-farm housing, mostly relating to health, safety, and efficiency, energy upgrades, that sort of thing. This would be moving them beyond OSHA standards to more directly improve the living conditions of on-farm workers. And then we would also have a set aside to fund operating costs associated with these improvements, so that farmers don't just automatically ignore the funding because they think that increased costs after they put them into place would negate the benefits, so to speak. Our idea is to request $5 million as current service level funding. Essentially, this would make it an ongoing part of our biennial budget requests. And so we would initially develop this as a pilot program, and if it works, we would think about moving toward perhaps including a third-party financial institution or a nonprofit to help us run it. Could you scroll down a little bit, Tim? So compliance recommendations. This is important. Along with this, we would be mandating increased compliance with regulations and with rules for this ag worker housing. So we would lengthen the compliance period across all ag worker housing investments. Currently, with the tax credit, it's 10 years. We would be pushing to increase that to 15 years or some other number that is yet to be determined, but it will be longer than 10 years. We would have additional posting requirements. Basically, we would make sure they have plenty of access to information to know what their rights are and who they can reach out to if the farm workers living in the housing find problems and need to know what avenues they have available to address them. And we would beef up the information we're requesting in the application, and we would also work to empower CBOs and CSOs to address worker housing concerns. Oh, and last but not least, we would be requesting limited duration positions to help monitor and oversee compliance. Currently, our biggest issue with the compliance monitoring part is we do not really have the staff to engage with robust compliance monitoring.
Awesome. So I'm going to stop presenting now. So, yeah, that is the kind of the rough kind of framework we have for this investment. So what we're looking for now is like I said, kind of any additional inputs, thoughts people might have had, about, what this looks like, that kind of stuff. I don't think I put it in there, but the thing to keep in mind is that this would be a grant. So this would not be a tax credit, it would be a grant. I think one of the things. Oh, yeah, Jenny, you should have gotten an emailed a copy of it. But yeah, while we're in discussion, I will send you
Tim, would it
another.
have come from you? I'll check through my emails here.
Yeah, it would have come through like the ag worker housing meeting, but I can send it to you very quickly.
Oh,
That's
I
no
might have it
problem.
here. Just a minute.
Okay.
I don't know. Oh
But
yes, from yesterday. I got that. Never.
So yeah, so we think we've kind of hit the nail on the head as far as trying to address kind of all the kind of the various stakeholder concerns, right? I know I think Jenny, you specifically had mentioned like operating costs. Um, Even though this isn't a community-based investment, the fact that we're taking that, you know, 15-20% that's typically for on-farm is for the ag worker housing tax credit and pushing that back to community-based only. That's something like close to $3.5 million extra every biennium for community-based housing. And then, we wanted to make sure we had that focus on not just how do we get up to the or OSHA standards that are yet to be released, but how can we guarantee there's an incentive to kind of go beyond that, that addresses advocate concerns. So I would say this, these, next Friday is when we make our kind of final absolute, no more kind of input recommendations. So as always, I've said, if you don't have like a response right now, or you're not sure, or you need to take it back and talk to your members or to your coworkers or your other advocates to figure out what additional input, we kind of have until Friday. Although realistically, you should be getting us earlier because we do need to have at least one more additional internal discussion. But I think the key piece here is that we do need to recognize that even though community-based housing and on-farm housing serves the same population, those needs are different, that we need to make sure we are also creating a current service level, so like an ongoing resource, right? We've recognized that there needs to be that support and that investment in both. So, yeah, I guess I'll open the floor to anyone who has like additional questions, things they want to add or thoughts or anything like that. Yeah, Nicole. Oh, I can't hear you, Nicole. My lip reading is not very good, so you're going to have to help me out. Okay, you're going to call in. Seeing and hearing no objection from the growers, we're good to go.
Well, while Nicole calls in, I'll just share. Farm Bureau has a committee made up of a lot of our housing providers that is actually meeting on Tuesday next week. So I'll be able to share this with them. But I do think the operating cost piece is a significant. It's a significant step forward. I guess my question for you is on the enforcement side, just because we have so many agencies in this space, What does that look like from a housing and community services space versus OSHA? And where I think we just need one agency of jurisdiction, and that's what my folks are going to ask for to really we we just have such a confusing regulatory landscape already. So I guess I'd like to hear from you guys about what that those enforcement requirements look like, and this additional posting, because we already have like our posters are huge, right? Like based on everything that we are required to post on the work site. So what does additional posting mean?
Yeah. So, as far as like enforcement and compliance, I don't think there's any desire to have OHCS staff uh, showing up to farms, even though I think by statute, if you take historically, if you've taken ag work housing tax credit money, you agree to allow that. I don't think there's any desire, and it's certainly not the intent of the agency to say, oh yeah, well, you're going to get a knock from or OSHA, and then 2 hours later, OHCS is going to show up. We don't have that capacity. It's not in our wheelhouse. I think the idea is, if we get complaints, because occasionally we do get complaints, is to kind of better work with or OSHA on those issues and say, hey, here's what we're hearing. This is what we're hearing from these individuals. But it's also something that's, we're still willing to discuss. And as far as posting requirements, I know we specifically heard from building codes that with all this new kind of potential housing that would come out, that they want to make sure there's stuff posted about like fire codes. Right, Martin? That was like what the fire guy specific. My apologies if he ever ends up listening to this. The fire guy on the task force was like, we want to make sure there's stuff about, does there need to be like an escape route? Does there need to be this, like that kind of additional information for those people in multiple languages? So, and I think that beyond that, it's maybe seeing if there's a willingness from local community based organizations to have like maybe their information posted on some of that, just so it's like a culturally relevant group that these workers can reach out to, and they're going to feel supported and comfortable talking to them. So, but that's again, we would have to see if those groups are willing to do that in the first place. So this is again a framework, and we all know that regardless of what gets recommended here and goes into the governor's recommended budget, we don't know what's going to happen with the gubernatorial race. I know from state agencies, I think everyone's kind of holding their breath about what's going to happen. So, and we know we have to get it through a legislature. We have to do all that. So it's certainly not like you're going to wake up tomorrow and have you're going to have me at the door being like, hey, I need to make sure you have enough flushing toilets. So yeah, I hope that kind of answers your question. I know it was kind of a vague-ish answer, but this is like, we're not a hyper specific thing, because we didn't want to go down a road, realize nobody likes what's down that road, and then have to walk it all back and feel like we're starting over. Does that make sense? Oh,
There, whoops, muted. I think so. I know I'm going to get a lot of questions on those 4 enforcement bullets, so I just want to put a pin in it. That it is helpful, but like between the roles, if we are looking at kind of staffing up on a temporary basis, OHCS in this space, is OHCS doing OSHA inspections? Is OHCS like are you just like or are you just are those temporary positions just communicating with Oregon OSHA? Like, I think that's going to be, and then the posters and the engagement as well. There's going to be a lot of areas that I think our folks are going to want to have a lot more discussions around. So, but I don't have those right now because I haven't talked to them about it. But this is super helpful as a starting point for the conversation.
yeah. No, those limited duration positions are mostly, Martin and Mitch, maybe correct me, it's like portfolio management, and the compliance is like fiscal compliance. It's not, these aren't going to be inspectors. Our executive director some time ago said there's not really a desire or appetite to make OHCS like a direct service agency. And that would be like a very direct type service. So no, I think ultimately it's just going to mean kind of closer coordination with OSHA, and trying to figure out a way to make sure those I think the bad actors, which I think, the farmers who are showing up in these spaces are not those. It's kind of those fringe elements and some of those contractors. So, okay, I think it was Nicole. Yeah, Nicole was definitely first. Nicole, and then we'll go to Rosie.
Yes, thank you. And sorry that I don't know why my microphone is not working on my computer, but here I am. So thank you for sharing this. Very helpful to see it. I had two questions that I'm hoping I can just get some more clarification around. So the first one is that sort of second bucket that you're talking about for the on-farm housing. It says funding for improving aspects of on-farm housing that are beyond Oregon OSHA standards. And I'm just hoping for a little bit more information of sort of what you're thinking about in that realm, like what is that scope, and then who or what determines what gets put on that list of what qualifies for funding above OSHA.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll start, and then maybe either Mitch or Martin can jump in. But I think the big focus is one, like efficiency, right? So let's say building a new roof or installing higher efficiency windows and doors or insulation, right? Things that are going to create kind of better, kind of more kind of living conditions, but also the hope is, kind of drive down some of those costs, those operating costs. And then health and safety. I think, during the ALH, one of the questions that advocates brought up was, distance from farm or from field to housing. And so the idea is, okay, let's say someone wants to do a new development, but their current infrastructure is 100 feet from the fields. They could theoretically go do, 200 feet, but they're going to need additional infrastructure costs, things like that. So that's something we would look and say, okay, this is something that directly addresses those health and safety concerns. So we would be willing to help fund, I believe, moving or developing that new infrastructure further away from the fields. It's also the sort of thing where, again, if people have, or I guess another example could be, if a farmer wanted to install more toilets or additional showers, kind of beyond the minimum, this again would be for that bucket of funding. And again, that operating cost would help offset, and we hope incentivize them to do that. So Martin, Mitch, I don't know, do you want to jump in any more with that?
Yeah, I think just to Jenny's points before too, a lot of this is a high level framework that we are going to have to work with OSHA and all of you all once approved to develop kind of the specifics behind a lot of this stuff. So Tim's thrown out, I think, a lot of really great ideas that we've talked through for how this funding could be used, but it will have to be tied to specific living conditions for the farm workers who are living in those units, and whether that's like Tim's saying, improving the appliances that exist and are at OSHA standards, but you want more energy efficient ones going in, or perhaps adding a shower that goes above those minimum standards, but your employees really could use it. I don't think we have that specific list yet, and we would probably want to get there, but generally tied specifically to the living conditions for the farm workers in a way that's justifiable and evidenced, I think, by an application. And yeah, I think that's sort of where we're at. And similarly with the compliance piece of it, I think we'd want to tie those components to what we're able to see, and we're going to have to work closely with OSHA, as Tim was saying, to kind of prove out some of those things, like that money went to what you said it was going to go to. I think that's kind of a baseline for most of our funding sources. And, you know, frankly, if we're committing grant funding to these properties, you know, at a higher level than before, the legislature is going to want to see some proof that and evidence that it's going to what the state approved the funding for. So being able to show that requires a little bit more compliance than we're doing right now. And again, we're not going to duplicate efforts with OSHA in any capacity, but we're trying to make sure we have the staff where we can support OSHA and get kind of that necessary compliance needed, not just to make sure those minimum standards are being met, but to make sure that the investments that we're making are having the impact and outcomes that we're committed to up front, so we can prove that to the legislature after the fact. Knowing that this would be an ongoing investment, we'd kind of have to prove it out every couple of years.
That all makes sense to me. Very helpful. I appreciate that additional information and context. My second question is very similar, talking about the funding to help offset operational costs of improvements. Just trying to wrap my head around sort of what examples of what this could be. So I'm thinking that this probably came from some of the conversations in the back around Senate Bill 1 and maintenance. So like, is this maintenance costs? So I think as an example that comes to mind would be based on current OSHA rules today, if a housing provider decided to install an air conditioning unit and so their electricity costs go up as a result, is that one of these, you know, operating costs of improvements? Is that an example of what you're looking at in this bucket? I just know that my growers will say, what does that mean? And I want to be able to give them at least an example of sort of what they can envision this being used for, or what they can envision qualifying.
Totally. And I can jump in, and Tim and Martin, you can correct me if I'm wrong or jump in with context. But it's exactly kind of the example you were giving. It's something that improves the living situation for the farm workers that is tied to an increased operational cost. And that increased operational cost, because of that improvement to the property, is what we would be providing funding for. So it wouldn't be maintenance that of kind of standard stuff that's already happening in the property. It would have to be tied to an improvement to the property, like adding air conditioning or something along those lines. I think that's sort of what we envisioned when we talked about that. And again, I still think that's the specificity of like what qualifies and what doesn't will be hammered out after we get the approval for kind of the higher level concept. But that's what we're pitching kind of right now.
Yeah, I'd just say that I think, you know, the internal discussions we had, which again, to kind of reframe or recenter, this is all, the intent of this is to improve the housing, right, of these workers. And so we know that's a cost, right? There's a cost that all these things are going to come with, or OSHA rules are going to have a cost. And so we want to make sure that there is that support to do that from the state. So that's why we talk about making this a current service level. So it's not like a one and done. Hey, you did the improvements. Here's some operating costs for a biennium, and then see ya. You know, hey, you're on your own. We don't want to rug pull kind of anyone in this situation. So, yeah, I think Mitch did it on the head, though.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that.
All right, so Rosie, you're next, and then I see Rachel. So Rachel, we'll have Rosie go first, and then we'll come to you, and you can talk. So Rosie.
Hey, Tim. So I do apologize for missing last week's meeting, but I've been super swamped and I didn't get a chance to read your recommendations until this morning. So I am trying to wrap around it. So I do apologize if I'm asking questions that you have already answered. So the deadline to provide comments to you or the recommendations to you is October 28th. Is that correct?
So that's when we're making our final recommendations
Okay.
to the task force. So I would say before that, I think we're probably going to meet internally one more time, probably mid next week. So the sooner the better for feedback.
Perfect. That gives me time at least Monday and Tuesday to meet with my team. So I'll go ahead and try and get something to you by the 26th.
Perfect.
Okay. So, and then the other thing
I'd say too, Rosie,
is,
like if you have a lot of feedback that you guys need to give us, set up a meeting. We're happy to talk with you guys about like if it's easier than writing up, you know, a memo or whatever. I think we're very open to that, just to make sure you have time and ability to give us
oh,
your feedback,
perfect.
because we value that a lot.
Thank you. Perfect. We'll do that. I'll take you up on that one. And then regarding the other thing, I see that you have two things going on. One of them is you're still wanting to keep aside the set asides for the community-based housing. And if I'm understanding correctly, that's still going to be ag tax credits, not the grant that you're proposing for the on-farm housing. Okay.
So the